Okay, thank you, Ingrid. Thank you for your introduction. So I prepared some notes on this text that we are reading together today. And I have to confess, at the beginning there is like some trouble in doing that. And the trouble I encountered consists in the fact that this text, as usually Durkheim text, basically has a double structure. Okay, so on one side you have a kind of, and that's part of what we are reading, like a definition. Okay, a definition of a phenomenon. In this case, how should we define socialism? How could we define it negatively, so distinguishing these social threat from other social facts? Then from that comes the comparison with communism. And then we have like a beginning of Durkheim trying to deal with this previous definition in a kind of historical way. Okay? So, and that's the third chapter that we are commenting. That is about how we can think the relation between communism historically, the relation between communism and socialism. How can we think that these two phenomena are entangled one in the other, and how can we make sense of that? Now, in order to answer this question, we have to go probably a little bit forward in the reading, I suppose, if I have time enough. Otherwise, I will go back during the discussion. Because as often is the case in Durkheim, it seems like that he's playing all his card on a definitory level, but then where the most compelling and normative arguments come from is generally historical reconstruction. Okay? So we can say that Durkheim in this sense is like properly an institutionalist. Okay? So now, how these texts work? These texts work, at least how I read it, in this way. Basically, Durkheim starts defining like a first point that is very important. Okay, that is very important. Is very important, I suppose, even for when you will confront what he says with other authors that you will treat during these seminars. That is, okay, there are two ways to treat what socialism is. One is treating it as a doctrine, and the other way is to treat it as a social fact. Okay, and as a social fact in Durkheimian sense, means we have to treat socialism as an ideal. Okay, and that's what Durkheim does in all these book. Even obviously, if he has to go into an analysis of what socialism doctrinally represents, nonetheless, what is his way to make sense of what is socialism, what is his functioning along modernity, is in considering socialism as a social fact. Okay, so this is made clear since the very beginning of the book. Okay, and in order to do so, he starts doing what I think is one of the topic of this seminar at large. That is, he starts trying to make sense, and you will see that it takes a long path in order to answer the question. What is the relation between socialism and sociology? Okay, and in order to do so, he say two things that seems like kind of contradictory, or if you prefer, if you are more generous with him, at least ambivalent. The first one is that he says that its history, I mean the history of socialism, blend with the very history of sociology. Okay, so run together, run parallel one to the other, go together, they interwin one with the other. But just after he says something like, and that's one of the very famous quotations of Durkheim, socialism is not a science, a sociology in miniature. It's a cry of grief, sometimes of anger, uttered by men who feel most keenly our collective malaise. Okay? So that's mean, basically, obviously, that if socialism is not a science, socialism has to be an object. And doesn't mean an object means in Durkheimian sense that it has to be treated as a social fact. And to treat something as a social fact means that we have to observe it as a thing. Okay? At least staying like in the first two chapters of the rules of sociological method. So, and that's, we make it explicit, saying, so we have to study socialism, and that's not it's kind of tricky, I suppose, like, as a move. We have to study socialism as we did, it says, as with society, marriage, the family, crime, punishment, responsibility, or religion. So, so he proceeds, as I said, as he generally does, and then, so giving like these like two paths and saying that's the path I'm taking, and then he says something that goes toward trying to define what socialism is, partially in a negative way. Let's see how. So he says that there are in society we can distinguish between social and individual facts, and he says strangely enough we can say, and that's, as you know, is like one of the theses of the division of social labor, that economic functions are often considered as individual. Okay, so what does it mean that social economical functions are individuals? It means just that are not they are unregulated. Okay, so economic functions are unregulated functions, and in these respects they are not properly social. But, and this is where one of the first definitions come from, he says, and I quote you, "It is easy to establish that among economic doctrines there are some which demand the linking of commercial and industrial activities to the directive," and here the expression that is important, "and conscious agencies of society," where conscious is important, is the important expression, and that these doctrines are opposed to others, which on the contrary call for a greater diffusion of these same commercial and industrial activities. It seems uncontestable, he says, that in giving to the first of these doctrines the name of socialist, we do not violate the customary meaning of the word. And from here, the first definition. We denote as socialist every doctrine which demands the connection of all economic functions of a certain or of certain among them, which are at the present time diffused to the directing or conscious centers of society. Okay, so what is important here to note, and why I insist on this expression, conscious agencies of society. So it's important because when you use this directing and conscious centers of society, what is understood basically is the state. Okay, so it seems like very strange, and it is, I suppose, even like from the point of view of historical sociology, a kind of strange definition of what a state is. So now, differently from every socialist of this period, that is mostly in Germany, the socialist of the chair, Durkheim does not understand, and that's my point, and that's, I think, his point in saying so, does not want to understand society as somehow subordinated to the state, okay? And this obviously is a main distinction that you have to take in mind when you think to compare Durkheim with Karl Marx too, because it doesn't understand society subordinated to the state, nor it understands the state as the political mediator of the ruling class's populations of means of production. So basically, what does it mean? It means that if you associate to state the function of thinking, you are saying something about, I would say something about authority and the distinction between authority and the monopoly of violence, okay? And I think that's a very relevant point for what we will comment after about Weber, because obviously in Weber this possibility is not, it cannot be followed. So, how can we understand this thing that the state is like a thinking function for society? Well, we cannot go deep in that because in order to go deep in that, we should go where Durkheim really confront this question and in his civic morals and professional ethics, mostly in chapter 4, where he gives all a theory of what is political society, how we should distinguish between a political society and the state, and why the state has this thinking function. Okay? Now, what is important for us, and that's why I put the accent on this expression, is to say that even if without like defining like in a structured way what this thinking function is, he says something immediately that makes sense of it, and that says to us something that can be interesting because it tells us something about this understanding of what socialism is about. In order to do so, I read you another quotation, still of this first chapter. We have already observed that we are saying a connection, and not subordination. And one cannot too strongly stress this difference, which is essential. Socialists do not demand that the economic life be put in the hands of the state, but into contact with it. Okay, so you have to have, that's my point, you have to have this understanding of the state in order to make this affirmation. Otherwise, obviously, the state would be about somehow a monopoly of power. On the contrary, they declare that it should react on the state at least as much as, if not more than, the latter acts on it. In their thinking, this report should have the effect not of subordinating the industrial and commercial interest to political interest, but rather of elevating the former to the rank of the latter. Okay? So it's this thing of elevation. I'm sure I now realize that I think on the third page of my presentation, and having prepared 20 pages, I will not be able to present everything, but nonetheless, is this understanding of putting, not subordinating industrial and commercial interest to political interest, that is all about what Durkheim understands with the word and with the concept of socialism. And what I think is very fascinating, and I tell you that because I will not be able to go deep into that because of the central chapter of the book, but what I think is very fascinating is that in order to do so, what Durkheim does is that he gives you an historical sociology of modernity that is very, very large, okay? And basically what he wants to show, and so I play my cards like directly, is what he wants to show is that what socialism is about is not just about redistribution. Socialism is about rearticulating secular and spiritual power after revolution. So that's one of these main points. This is a point that is inherited by the socialist Saint-Simonian, and that's at least at the same time what makes his own understanding of what socialism like very problematic and very hard even to compare to other doctrines, because either you resemantize entirely what socialism means, or if you just stay on the position about one concept, it's very hard to understand. So, I skip a little bit, and just to conclude this, like first definition, we have seen the definition that he gives about what is socialism. We can say something about this chapter, and we can resume it like that. I think that this chapter gives a lot of elements, and the first elements are like he gives like some negative, what I call negative conclusion. I would not have the time to go through all of them, but what is not. Okay, just to take in mind like some bullet points. So, what socialism is not, according to Durkheim. Socialism is not about the abolition of the state, for sure. Socialism cannot be restricted to working class ideology, so there is not this possibility. There is like obviously Marx's doctrine of thinking a class that is at the same time singular and universal. Socialism cannot be associated to state control over economy, for the reason that I just told you. Socialism is not about charity and providence, and this is a way to make us two steps backward from like the
the paternalistic function of the first welfare reforms in the the Prussian state, and finally, socialism does not coincide with class struggle. This does not mean at all that Durkheim has to be read as a functionalist, because I don't think so. There's a lot of room in Durkheim theory of socialism for conflict, but class struggle is not the element that defines what socialism. So, if instead of doing that, so we skip this negative definition and want to give some positive one, just according to this first chapter, we can say, I think, at least the following. Socialism is a form. Socialism is, from a sociological standpoint, first and foremost, we have seen it, a social fact. It's not a doctrine. And so, as a social fact, as an idea that has been created and produced and emerged along a struggle that apparently we can locate in the period that goes from the 18th to the 19th century. But in reality, and that's why all these historical parts on Saint-Simon are so important, instead, the origin of this struggle between spiritual and secular powers start in the 11th century and start with the emergence of the communal culture in Europe. Nonetheless, this I don't think we'll be able to get into that. So the first point, socialism is, from a sociological standpoint, is not a doctrine, is a social fact. Secondly, socialism is about reconnecting economic functions to the state. Thirdly, and consequently, socialism is about the transformation of the very function of the state. And fourthly, and lastly, socialism is about transformation of different institutions beyond the statehood, and is about a democratization of them. So about socialism and communism. So the second chapter. Durkheim mentioned the fact is Robert Owen the first to having invented the name. I think that today we know that is not true, and because interestingly enough for this course, a French researcher discovered in an article like 15 years ago that both the names of socialism and the name of sociology have been invented, even if not adopted in the methodology, in like the methodical way that has been done after by, for example, Auguste Comte, by Emmanuel Seyès. Okay, so these two words, socialism and sociology, socialism and sociology, they are both being invented by him. So the point is that the second strategy, in order to make sense of what socialism is about, is like trying to say why socialism has to be distinguished from communism. And I think, if you like having read the text, that you have been confronted to something that I felt like something that is like a tension within his argument. Okay, and this tension, for me at least, consisted in that. The first point, in order to make a distinction between what communism and socialism are, according to Durkheim, seems to me very easy and consists in saying communism is not a social fact, and so consequently cannot be treated as a thing. And that's why, because, and you have read it, the presence of communist theories along the history are very scattered. Okay? There is no way that we can give proving a good historical sociological argument in order to say, okay, what these ideas, what these ideologies are made of, why it's being produced, why they emerge in a certain. So this relation of this cut relation to history is in some respects is what could close the game and say, okay, that's the difference, the possibility of one of being treated as social facts, the other not. But
I'm not sure that, and I'm more than sure it's not the only answer that Durkheim gives. And so the point is that I think is an important point, is at least an important question to raise, is what is the function of communism for Durkheim? It is a real social fact, it is a real social object. And on one side we have just answered to it, no, it's not for this reason. But as we see along the arguments that presented by Durkheim, it's not as easy as that, okay? And it's not as easy as that because we will see that, especially in the part concerning the 18th century, what he's saying is that there is more than one relation between the two. So one thing that I think we can start saying, and Durkheim himself says in this second chapter, is that another possibility in order to make sense of the difference between communism and socialism is basically the same. In order to make sense of this difference, we have to use another difference, that is the one between philosophy and sociology. So, so Durkheim himself suggests something on this kind, saying the following: it is a peculiarity of philosophical thinking to develop itself only in a discontinuous manner. So the possible ambiguity comes from the fact that communism is not an historical object because its presence is captured in history and is historic, and is an historical object par excellence, because communism in this respect, not being a philosophical ideology, can be considered, and is considered by Durkheim for sure, like a marker of the distinction between what is a modern society and what is a pre-modern society. So in this sense, obviously what I'm referring to is that basically what he's doing is making a distinction between communism and socialism in terms of two forms of social relationship and two forms of solidarity. And these two forms of solidarity obviously are like mechanic solidarity and organic solidarity. So, so now we get into what I think would be, and I really suggest you like these parts, like this chapter 7, 8, and 9 of the book, because I think they are really amazing. The parts where he deals with this whole conflict between secular and the spiritual powers. But we are going into that, no? So we are going into the real question of the book, because once we say that socialism is to be treated as a social fact, we have to make an history of it. And in order to make a history of it, we have to say what are the conditions, the historical condition for its emergence. And Durkheim's answer, as we have seen, are three. These conditions has to be considered on one side ideological, on the other side institutional, and thirdly economical. And when he speaks about what are these ideological conditions, basically he refers to the fact that in order to think socialism in terms of a reconnection of different industrial functions, this means to reconnect economy and society. And reconnect the economy and society is something that would never be possible even to think in pre-modern society, because for pre-modern society, economic activities were considered like a kind of sacrilege in relation to and so what basically Durkheim is suggesting is that in this respect, at least, is another like definition of what communism is about, is nothing else that a reformulation in political terms or ideological terms of the distinction between sacred and profane. So these are the ideological conditions in order to let emerge what socialism is about. Secondly, there are institutional conditions. So we have to confront a properly statehood, a properly state institution in order to see socialism emerging. And thirdly, it is essential, Durkheim says, that the regime of big industry has been established. Okay? And
And here it's finished, and then we go into the historical part that I don't think now I can confront. It will take a long time to do so, but I can probably try to give a sense of some elements of it. So what I think is very interesting in this theory of Durkheim is that basically gives an account of the relation between socialism and 19th century political culture that is not all focused on what he says in this third chapter about enlightenment. Okay, so what basically what he is trying to do is to reconstruct the entire history of socialism and to show that what socialism is to rearticulate this secular and spiritual power. And what does it mean? And why he starts doing so, reconstructing from 12th century social organization. Well, in this it follows completely Saint-Simon. No? Saint-Simon argument to say what we generally understood as the flourishing of this opposition has been misunderstood, because what we have to take in mind is that the classical opposition between secular and spiritual that happened in the 13th century and in the early medieval times is an opposition between the clergy on one side and the military on the other. And what happens with communal culture and scientific culture that starts long before scientific revolution, in a proper sense, so long before early modernity, is that these two main elements in order to organize spirituality and secularity change, and this change happens in a way that is not accomplished. Okay, that's all the theories and so on. This way is not accomplished. It cannot be accomplished. Cannot be accomplished because this shift from the army to the communal power, so the army to what Saint-Simon called the industry, and the clergy to the science, is a conflict that do not find along modernity, along early modernity, a way to make sense of his social structures. Okay, so it's basically, if you want, take it very with a lot of approximation, but if you want, is like a little bit remembering me Koselleck's thesis about the pathogenesis of modernity. No? Is somehow what he's trying to explain is saying all what we produce, enlightenment and the change in our understanding of the relation between spirituality and secularity, is something that has not been fulfilled because the culture that tried to interpret this change was not able to change the social structure in a real sense. And then you get into Saint-Simon. So Saint-Simon and the socialist project, according to Durkheim, are about that, are about reconnecting economic functions in a way that is organized by the state without being controlled by the state. But this is not everything. What is more important in order to understand what happens is to say socialism is about having understood that the only way to make sense to this split that started in the 12th century is to reorganize society as such. Okay? So basically, it's a reaction. So that's one of the reasons why this generation of sociology, especially in French, but not only, were so seduced by conservatism. Okay, because conservatism was going against the drain of formal defense of rights, using this kind of arguments, historical and sociological arguments. And what the move is here, that is the move of Saint-Simon, is we have to do the same but in order to do the same, we have to bring in socialist ideas, and this means, with a Polanyian expression, ante litteram, is like to re-embed the state of our industrial organization within like a more general social dimension. So, and I conclude here just saying the last word. I'm sorry that I skipped around, but I realized it was too long. What I want to add is something about the ending of this book. No? So the very conclusion, the last 2 pages, because if you read it carefully, they are very interesting. They are very interesting because the guy, Durkheim, spent the last chapter for last, like the 11th chapter, defending Saint-Simonian, saying why they make sense, why we have to think socialism in these terms, and so far and so on. And at the end of the day, nonetheless, you see there is like strong criticism. No? There is strong criticism because the way he says basically Saint-Simonian, and especially the last generation Saint-Simonian, that is Bazar, in order to make sense of this rearticulation of spiritual and secular power, basically they found the ground a new metaphysic. That is like this, what he calls this pantheistic materialism, and so far and so on. And say this is a fallacy. Okay, we can't go there. We really can't go there. What we can do, and that's where I think what we say at the very beginning, what's the relation between sociology and socialism is to understand that that sociology is not about disconnecting then social sciences, the idea of a religious regeneration that was supported by the Saint-Simonian, and the socialist idea. What is important, what has to be done, what is the project for Durkheim, I think, of sociology, is not to take this disconnection for granted, nor to affirm the identity of the two, as in the Saint-Simonian program. Okay, so the point is how you rearticulate. What's the epistemological project of sociology is about that, rearticulating these 3 forces: science, religion, and socialism. Okay, and I will stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Nicola, and I hope that you can give us a piece of writing that we can also put on the syllabus so that people can read the rest of your stuff. We should have done that already, but of course with such heavy readings, we didn't do it. Now, I'm only going to take 15 minutes and maximum 20, but certainly I will stay within the maximum of introducing also Weber. But I think I want to say a couple of things about Durkheim's extremely interesting book, which I must say I never studied before this class, and I learned a lot from it. But I want to stay with the Durkheim-Weber comparison, and rather than just Durkheim alone, which is what you did so very well. And I think those who read these texts must really keep in mind that there is a difference in space, a difference in time, and a difference in context between the two texts. Well, the difference in space, of course, is Germany as against France, or France against Germany in chronological order. Obviously, French socialism, which is a perhaps more original phenomenon than even the German, has its own history, and though eventually Marxism becomes the dominant ideology of French socialism, and the two countries' contexts converge somewhat, never completely, still, at the time of Durkheim's writings, as some people say, and I don't know, you know this much better, everybody is Saint-Simonian. Now, of course, Marx was influenced by Saint-Simon too, but I think the French meant this in another way. Obviously, Max Weber, who knows this history, is aware of it, but nevertheless, he's operating in a country, and let me also mention the temporal difference, 20 years later, where Marxism was completely hegemonic. That was not always the case, as you will find out if you read texts like Schorsky's German Social Democracy or many others. In the 19th century, there were two major streams of German socialism, Lassalle's more reformist version and Marx's. After the unification of these movements, and we'll speak about that next week, we'll speak about it this Thursday actually, the unification of these movements, at least the ideology became Marxist. Lassalle, you know, how many has even read Lassalle here? I mean, this is really, would be, even among professors, that would be a trick question because there would be not many who have. But in Germany, that would have been the case too at the time of Weber's essay, though not 15, 20 years before that. So Marx is the issue. Now, we know, you didn't say this, but of course you know this very well, that Durkheim's book, with its own theoretical introductions and long sections on Saint-Simon, were meant to be only a first of several volumes, at least as Marcel Mauss tells us, because I don't know this myself. The next volume was going to be on Proudhon, incredibly interesting for this class, what that would have been. Maybe there are manuscripts, but I'm not aware of any. And then he was going to also write on Marx and maybe even Lassalle. So he was going to write on the rest, but as far as this volume goes, he's with Saint-Simon and presents himself a definition which at least is compatible with Saint-Simon's definition, not necessarily, I don't think it would be compatible with any of Marx's conceptions. So though he's interested in all the rest and even mentions them in the text occasionally, he is representing a particular stage of French against German socialism. And finally, the context. He's writing at a piece in, I think it's the 1890s, the text we're reading has been written. I think I even have it written down. Between 1895 and 96, Mauss says, this particular text was composed, the rest were going to follow and never really did. Weber's text, as we just checked with Benoit, was April of, did you say April of 1918? Or June, you said June of 1918, even more interesting, June of 1918, with the German Revolution, the first rebellion coming in Kiel, if I'm not mistaken, in November. You can check that. So it is very close to an actual revolutionary breakthrough in one country, and obviously written in the middle of a war where the war changed lots of things he might have himself believed. So there are very significant differences among the authors. Now, I think for the sake of nevertheless justifying including them together, I find also there is overlap. There's overlap between them. Alvin Guldner talks about overlap between Marx and Durkheim in his introduction to this, the English version of this volume. Not so interesting. I think what he says in the corporatist part seems more accurate. But there's an overlap which I would like to point to, which I think is really, really interesting. And that has to do with the fact that you didn't get to mention, after you mentioned the definition, that for Durkheim, I always pronounce the name in German, Durkheim, but it's, I don't even know how the French say Durkheim or something like that. Of course, it's a German name, but what can you do? He was Alsatian. So Durkheim, I will continue the German pronunciation. And Durkheim, after defining socialism, mentions that it could emerge in two versions. This point he puts twice in somewhat different ways, but they're really interesting. And these two versions have to do initially with initiation from above and from below. He doesn't talk about how any version of socialism would be established in France at the time. He stays away from the politics, at least here. I'm sure probably in letters and elsewhere he did not. But certainly two ways, and the first indication of the outcome, of the difference in outcome, would be state socialism on the one side and worker socialism on the other, as it says. That's the less interesting part, though, because just a few pages later in the text, he suggests that the very fact that he has defined the term not in terms of subordination, subsumption, and domination, but interconnections, the question of primacy is left open. You could, of course, have a primacy of the state, and one would sort of assume, he doesn't say so, that that happens when it is a state-produced project, a state-initiated, a state-steered project. And then the other option would be then the primacy of the economy. And it doesn't really follow, but perhaps one could consider this as a possibility, that when it is initiated from below, it's more likely that you have that outcome. And socialisms of either would still fall under the definition of closer connections between the two realms, but the political form would be different, or because we have to watch with this term political, the steering form, let me use a neutral term, would be different in the two possible cases. Now this comes close already to Saint-Simon, whose writings I've never personally studied, but Durkheim now introduced me to them, and it really looks like Saint-Simon in two of his major texts to which Durkheim refers to, has two kinds of organization which his socialism could take. Correct me along the way if I get this wrong. I'm only following Durkheim, which could, for all I know, not be right. One form of organization which I think is consistent with the second type, namely the economy's primacy, not necessarily domination, but primacy, would be one in which associations emerging from economic life would begin to take over the remaining, and there will be very few remaining functions of what states used to be, or what states used to have. This, I think, is in Durkheim's presentation, occurs in a text of Saint-Simon called Organisateur, the organizer. I think it must be the earlier text, but I don't really know. Now, another Saint-Simon text, the Système Industriel, this industrial system, though, has a different scheme in which the old political structures would stay, Durkheim says, but the old ministries would both change their personnel and their function. The most important ministries would now recruit only industrialists among the leaders, and the function of these ministries would be coordination, first of all gathering information, but some kind of mild coordination using the resources of science, which is very important, and I won't go back to that particular topic for the sake of time. Well, this is the scheme, and there is something in Max Weber, to point to an overlap and to turn to Weber nearby, which indicates his partial similarity to the overall mapping out of possibilities for socialism. Obviously, for Durkheim, there would be two socialisms, ideal, typically pure, the state steered version, which would be a top-down version, we can't even call it necessarily a state, and what he calls an anarchist version. 2 or 3 times in this text, anarchism shows up as a socialist possibility. interestingly, because given his critique of communism, and I hope you understand that Durkheim does not mean, when he speaks about communism, the later difference which was made then in the, well, initially by the Bolsheviks between socialism and communism. His idea of communism doesn't have a particularly radical statist version of socialism in mind. But in any case, anarchism fits into the socialist scheme, but anarchism would be ideal, typically, if it were possible, a pure dominance of the economy, or a pure primacy of the economy, in which the political would disappear. That's the anarchist part. It would be the end of the political. You know, of course, that Marx has this too, but it's a stage model, whereas in Durkheim it appears as two extreme possibilities, between which you could look at a lot of different socialisms. Probably Durkheim thought there would be a large variety of possibilities, but it would be a single scale and options between those two extremes. Now Weber has the extremes, but he introduces another criterion, evidently, because in Germany, since Bernstein's book, in Bernstein's article in Vorwärts, which were in the mid-1890s, and then the book 1898, everybody's debating and discussing our topic for Thursday, namely reform or revolution. I mean, in Germany, maybe in France it wasn't such a great topic, because there was no Bernstein who would have introduced the conflict, even though, obviously, even Marxian socialism became reformist in France. Indeed, the French reformists participated in government way before any German social democrat ever did. But still, in France, this was not a central issue. In Germany, it was. And Weber now, in a very convenient way, introduces into the scheme a second polarity. The first polarity is statist, societalist, let's call it that. Mm-hmm. The other polarity is reform and revolution. And as you know, if you know how to construct a 2-by-2 scheme, that this creates 4 possibilities, right? Anybody can do that, but I will mention it quickly. You could have a revolutionary top-down model. You could have a revolutionary bottom-up model. You could have a reformist top-down model, and you could have a reformist top-down model. And in Germany, at the time of his writings, all 4 existed, though you have to look a little bit over the Rhine to see, or not just over the Rhine, but over the Alps, toward the south, your country, is Italian, to see really the 4th possibility, namely revolutionary from the bottom possibility, playing an important role. It existed in Germany. Revolutionary syndicalism has a general European history, but in Germany it was certainly less important than elsewhere. These are the 4 possibilities. And Weber, being very thorough, I think in this essay, and I am really watching the time, 5 more minutes max, tries to basically discredit 3 and make an alliance with the 4th. The last part is very difficult to prove, but I will try to prove it very briefly. As far as arguing against the other 3, well, as far as the argument against, let's start for the one that is least significant for him because of Germany, the argument against the revolutionary syndicalist option, even if they won, which he says in a very period of a wartime turmoil you can't entirely exclude. So even in Germany, it doesn't entirely exclude that possibility. Even if they won, they would have to overcome their anti-political and anti-intellectual positions to run anything. So sure, you can run a factory, a small cooperative factory now, but once you have to face an economy and the coordination of all these factories, you're going to need larger and more political coordinating structures, and for this they have to hire the intellectuals. And if they don't like to do that, that means they will run the economy to the ground extremely quickly. This is his first argument. Now, the reformist version of the bottom-up approach, which also would have the unions. By the way, I forgot to mention that the bottom-up approaches for him have the unions as their subject, whereas the top-down approach has the party as its agency or its subject. The bottom-up reformist approach with the unions as the subject can improve conditions under capitalism. This is what has already been happening. And so in that sense, it does not really raise the question or solve the question, the social question, the socialism problem. He doesn't spend too much time criticizing it because he considers it to be ineffective and certainly not much more than what was possible. Even Bismarckian conservatism, after all, enacts reforms of the type that the reformist version wants. Now, of course, we'll talk about this next time. There's a lot left of the reformist version having to do with political democratization, which Weber does not take up. But in any case, he doesn't consider the reformist version from the bottom, the union-driven one, to be a really significant problem, a significant challenge. Now, of course, the one that he considers to be a significant challenge is the top-down revolutionary option. There's very little secret that this was not a function of the fact that he foresaw the revolution in Germany coming a couple of months later, since another revolution has already occurred. And that, of course, is the Russian Revolution, which represents a really significant challenge for him. At least at a time of wartime, at a time of war, in spite of even Marxian assumptions about evolution, socialism has been able to triumph in its revolutionary version, at least in one country. Weber spent some time, very much in the path of Bernstein and many other writers, we'll talk about them next time, trying to show that the expectation of revolution in the most developed capitalist countries will not be fulfilled because there is no absolute immiseration of the proletariat, because there is no dramatic increase of size of the proletariat and the decrease of the size of other strata, because there are crises, but no crisis will be fatal for capitalism, and because although there is concentration of capital, nevertheless, there is also an important role for small business and for small size property, especially in the area of agriculture. So in the developed countries, it was never going to happen, but it did happen in the context of wartime in one place, Russia. And I am sure in his own mind, writing in June, he can imagine that if the weakest link, to use Lenin's terminology, was in Russia, perhaps the second weakest link is Germany. After all, the link broke in Russia because of a defeat in war, right? Russia's defeated in the First World War, amazingly enough. Countries on the side of the Entente were not automatically winners. This is an eternal grudge in Italy, that we were on the winner's side and nevertheless we didn't win. Important even for Mussolini. But Russia certainly did not win the war. It was defeated, and there was a very unfair and exploitative peace treaty imposed on Russia in Brest-Litovsk, discussed by Weber and justified by Weber in this text. But Germany is going to lose too. This is June. It was foreseeable already. United States in the war, with the actual lines of the front having shifted fairly dramatically in Germany's direction. The turmoil toward the east, the other German allies are in a weak position. So Germany is going to lose too. So the Leninist option is an option here. And for this reason, he, and I will end certainly on this point, he feels most he's most interested in terms of the four options that he has outlined in debating with Leninism, with the revolutionary option, which in his mind, and this is classical Weberian theory, which you could certainly derive from Economy and Society, as well as even the Protestant Ethic and other texts that you might have read. The result of that particular formula will be to confirm the immanent trend of contemporary development of modern society. But that immanent trend is the triumph of the bureaucrat, the official, not the triumph of the proletariat. The Russian experience, and he is still interested in learning from it, and he says that he's observing it carefully, which he undoubtedly was. The Russian experiment, he predicts, is going to confirm the Weberian theory. But it will not mean socialism in either the way that Durkheim defined it, or the way that 3 out of the 4 options that he has discussed had in mind. It will mean socialism in terms of the 4th option, the triumph of the rule of the official. And because of that, and I'll end with this, because of that, he wants to have a friendly discussion, a loyal discussion with state socialists who actually remain Marxists. For him, Lenin broke with Marx by shifting from the developed capitalist world to a very much underdeveloped country as a terrain to socialist revolution. But he knows, Weber knows, that even among the radicals, as you will see on Thursday, in the German movement, this was criticized because of the replacement of proletarian democracy by party dictatorship. So he wants to say to German socialists, probably on both ends of the spectrum between democracy and authoritarianism now, in other words, Bernstein on the one side, with whom he obviously sympathizes at an analytical level, and even the revolutionaries on the other side, Liebknecht and Luxemburg, who are about to lose their lives a few months after this, that if you actually accept the Marxian theory of social evolution, then you have to work for democratization, for the emergence of a parliamentary representative system in Germany, and you have to abandon the idea which is coming from the East and which he sees as probably a terrible threat, namely the idea of skipping stages, the idea of breaking the weakest link, the idea of breaking the duality of revolutionary theory and reformist program in favor of revolutionary theory. Well, the 4 quadrants are the party as the agency, the political party, and the union as the significant agency. So there's the top column, and then the vertical column is evolutionary and revolutionary, and you could find 4 combinations, and he thinks all 4 exist in the socialist movement. And what I said was that Durkheim doesn't pay too much attention to the revolutionary reformist split and doesn't take any stand, although of course the whole tenor of his work is reformist, I would say. What Weber is interested in is in particular having a debate with the revolutionary party-led quadrant. Well, it dismisses them on different grounds. In other words, if you really want to say what a Weberian argument against, I could put it on the board because then I don't know which is the first, the reformist party-led quadrant, the argument there would be that the Marxian theory of development is false. Right? You're never going to get to it that way through reforms because the immanent tendencies of capitalism do not point to socialism. That's a prediction he didn't make. Had he made it, he would have been very lucky, right? Because you see the history of social democracy 70 years after that prediction, which he didn't make, and it would have been confirmed. The argument against the reformist union-led quadrant is that it will only ameliorate conditions, it will never lead to their transformation. And the argument against the revolutionary unionist quadrant is that even if they won, the project would immediately collapse because they would have to construct something like a state in which experts would play an important role, and so on. So those are his three arguments, developed not in a systematic way, but somewhat loosely in the text. But the most important debate, I think, is with, that really mattered to him, if you place the essay chronologically, is with party-led revolutionary Marxism. It's an important issue for Weber. They voted for bureaucrats just like the German mainline social democrats. But then after that, the people you call Austro-Marxists were breaking with the main line, as well as in Germany, the independent social democrats and the Spartacists in different ways broke with the mainline social democrats. So they represented a problem. Weber still had expectation, though, that the original leadership of these parties, whether in Austria or Germany, will remain the more important actor. And it is with them that he wanted the military officers to fraternize. I think that's the idea here, is, you know, take them seriously and have a fair, he calls it, I don't have the German with me. Well, I do have the German, but I didn't look at this word. A loyal discussion with them. In English is loyal discussion with them, which would mean that, you know, have a friendly discussion and consider how we can actually now do some things together. I think Weber by this time is quite willing to give up the authoritarian regimes, which he himself for a long time didn't favor anyway, and he wants the socialists to give up revolution. And I think that's the goal of that. And he wants these military officers to shoot syndicalists, by the way. He says, that's a very interesting part of the passage. He says, and he mentions terror, which of course some syndicalists were terrorists, other syndicalists were not. But Weber says, these are the ones you got to really worry about. He doesn't say, because it's an academic talk, doesn't say those are the ones we have to shoot. But that's the implication. Whereas these other socialists, we better start talking too quickly before this whole thing goes to pot. I mean, you know, I'm putting this in very folksy ways, not Max Weber's terminology, but that's what's going on here. I mean, you really have to place this talk. Benoit says June, right?
Summer.
Summer of 18. I mean, this whole system of the Central Powers is coming to grief. I mean, I think they lost in the mountains already against the Italian army, which initially they had won victories against. The Russian front was freed, so they didn't win one big victory, but the French front was on the verge of collapsing, and the ships could not even take off from Kiel anymore. So the naval dimension of this, which was important early part of the war, was in terrible shape. So Weber, who was really a highly realistic thinker, interested in military strategy, knew already where this thing is likely to go. Plus, he didn't like the autocracy. So what would be better, you know, to come to an agreement with what used to be called the majority socialists, who are probably no longer even the majority, but had control over many of the political institutions, including the unions. What would be better than us making some kind of agreement with them? And in Germany, there were such agreements subsequently, as we know from the sad history of the revolution movement there. And that's what Weber is I think that's the point of this talk. Otherwise, to spend his time giving a talk to military officers about socialism would have been very absurd.
Yes.
Okay, okay. About charity compulsory, I'm not 100% sure, but I think that the only point of Durkheim here is that it's going against a kind of there is chapter 4 is on Sismondi, and mostly it deals with the physiocrats, and there are passages where he says there are things that we could say about socialism and physiocrats, and more generally about the economics, what he calls the economic school. That is, we can read them, these schools, sociologically as symptoms of the same need. Okay, so I think that when he refers to this ideology, let's call it, of charity, he thinks about something that even if the other way around is like a compulsory affects toward solidarity instead of a compulsory desire and or compulsory and free possibility of let self-interest converge. Okay? So basically it's trying to make sense of the fact that in order to give a sociological explanation of what socialism is about, first of the thing, you have to denaturalize it. And that's not what the Saint-Simonian school did till the end. And that's why I think he makes the distinction between the first school, that is Saint-Simon, and this turn toward a more kind of metaphysical kind of approach, while this metaphysical kind of approach, while this ideological turn of the Saint-Simonian school, because basically what he says is that instead of finding the unity within society, setting on thinking that the problem of socialism is the reorganization of the articulation of different economical function, you postulate the existence of this unity since the beginning with this kind of metaphysics. Okay, and obviously there are these elements in Saint-Simon too, but his point is this happened after. So I think that when he thinks about charity in compulsory terms, is the reverse of the free convergence of self-interest of the economists. The other tests that I know were, but I would be here would be a little bit difficult here to go back to it, because I should reread it sincerely, where I'm sure you can find something of this kind about this criticism of communism. Sorry.
You go ahead. No, it's on communism.
Yeah.
So just one point. Of course, he didn't write his book on Marx, so we don't know what he thought. He obviously knows the title of the most important work is Communist Manifesto. Nevertheless, I would maintain, and Nicola has to correct me if I'm getting this wrong, is that for Durkheim, the bulk of Marxist doctrine belongs to socialism. It fits into the definition. Moreover, he thinks communism is not the product of industrial society. It is a philosophical scheme that has its own independent, whereas Marxian communism, in his Marxian socialism, in his mind, is a product of industrial society. But there is still a point where what Benoit implied would again come back, because Durkheim has a very interesting point which fits into the traditional reformist socialism in a kind of self-critical way. He suggests that even either of the versions of socialism he has in mind, if they were actualized, that would not mean either equality, full equality, nor it would mean the disappearance of social problems. There would be still disease, there would be natural disasters, there would be conflict, potential conflict among those who are unequal, and communism will reappear, he says. So communism, which is in a way an eternal philosophical quest that periodically reappears, will reappear again. And of course, you could say that the double scheme of Marx, right, which we'll talk about a lot next time, namely of the first phase, the transition, the second phase, and eventually the goal, indicates that communism has returned conceivably within Marx's own writings. And Durkheim, had he written a book on Marx, which he didn't, could have said that what is wrong with Marx is that he kind of reintroduces communism too early and links it to the socialist project, which is one of the possible versions of socialism, but it will be vitiated if it is linked to this idea of absolute equality, the idea of each according to their needs, which is actually a Saint-Simonian formula. I don't know if Durkheim ever comments on that particular formula. Abundance, full abundance, keeping the economy away from what is really important to human beings, a little bit like in the Grundrisse, where the labor time is so reduced that we can spend our time doing only all the other things that the economy will represent, only a very small portion of it we actually do. All these ideas, for Durkheim's point of view, are communist ideas. And from his perspective, socialism, if it also tries to be communism at the same time, might vitiate itself. That, I think, would be the way that I would conceive of Durkheim's book on Marx, of first showing him within the tradition, representing a pole of that tradition, then bringing in communism perhaps on an ideological level, and then perhaps undermining the socialist project by doing that too soon. No one knows, right? What it would have been like. But of course you know that he's not an adherent to the Marxist camp.
Yeah, sure.
We also know he knows the Communist Manifesto, and he must have known who would have been. Yeah, well, but there were others, right?
He has a piece critical.
Yes, right. And Marxist son-in-law. There were people who were known in France. So there is a Marxist wing. I don't know at the moment of his writing how strong, how weak it was. Certainly it was much stronger later. Anyway, sorry, but you were going to say something on communism too.
No. My only point is was just say is right. This article on Labriola that where we could find. I think that there are insights there about that. But I mean about the European project. I mean the European ideological background of the thing. I mean, there will be a lot to say. What I think I can say, the only thing I feel like saying here is that something that goes toward your observation about the fact that there are elements in order to say that we can find in Durkheim, at least according to what he says in these seminars on socialism, that there is a space both for a kind of more anarchist, Proudhonian-oriented kind of socialist project, and on the other more kind of state-derived kind of project. And I think that this is important in order to answer your question. That's my only answer. In order to answer your question, you will immediately answer this question too, in the sense that you have to make sense, I think, of the fact that probably these two things, so these two options that you mentioned, so the anarchist one and the state-centered one, are like, you can really have good arguments in order to say that can be complemented. And I think that they can be complemented for the very easy reason for which state for Durkheim is not about administration. And that's one of his main points in the civic morals and professional ethics. Okay, so this means that the only function of statehood is to produce what he says more clear kind of collective representations.
Does this mean that via this representation we can that's what he has in mind, reorganizing via some kind of state activity, this kind of reorganization of activity, economical activities? But I would say no, because if you look both in this book that I should just mention and in the division of social labor, what he has basically in mind, or at least in the first part, I mean in the first introduction, that then does not appear in the second edition of the Division of Labor, all his political project, as you know, is a corporate project, okay? And this corporate project is about like trying to, is this, yes, a seed of working counseling that is like, the idea is basically to reorganize, to moralize, in his words, the activity of society, and in order to do so you can't have neither the individual nor the state, because the state has not this power, because the state has not this administrational power, because he understands in another way. So the only thing that you can do in his understanding is inventing new form of mediations, and these new form of mediations are corporations. These corporations, obviously, you can understand it in the way this word has been taken after in the Italian tradition. Corporation is basically associations of workers, okay? And so I think that these two things goes together, and so and I think when he speaks about European internationalism and the European federalism, you have to have this model in mind of federation in order then to understand what he thinks.
That's really interesting what you say. Just a couple of more points. One, we mentioned name Proudhon, so he was going to write the second volume of Proudhon. We went through Proudhon in this class, and I would say just on the basis of those three texts, and I'm not really, haven't read the whole Proudhonian corpus, which is a lot of books, but we stressed three books: property, what is property? We stressed the revolution of the 19th century, and we stressed the federalism book. Proudhon, if Durkheim were writing the Proudhon book, he would very likely say, possibly he could say, that the property book is a communist book. I mean, after all, Proudhon wants to replace property by possession. And obviously, on that level, even the most radical communist doctrines have an element of possession within their utopian conceptions. If you turn to the second book of Proudhon that we dealt with, it's pretty clear that he is now shifting from a communist to what Durkheim would call a socialist doctrine, where economic institutions would begin to play the role of societal coordination, and where the structure of violence, which is associated with the state, domination, would be dramatically reduced. The third book, the federalism book, and you just mentioned Durkheim too, in his book, seems to indicate the consistency of corporatism, associationism, we call it with Proudhon. The compatibility of associationism and federalism takes, I think, another step toward a somewhat statist end, because the federal state would have at least some state-like qualities. But from a Durkheimian point of view, Proudhon, whom he knew probably extremely well, moves from communism to two different versions. You could call them anarchism, or you could call them socialism. But one version is a little more statist than the other. What she's saying is that you don't find blueprints in Marx. That's the utopians from Marx's point of view. You revolutionary transformation of the capitalist system will then be the context in which you invent, create, transit to the new. And in that sense, isn't he different? Aren't Marx and Durkheim very different? Because Durkheim, after all, in the case of Saint-Simon, spells out in detail some forms of social and political organization. Political, you have to watch the word. And even in his own version, the corporatism thesis, and we should probably all read Professional Ethics, Civic Morals, and the second preface to the Division of Labor. Durkheim makes a kind of attempt in outlining what his alternative would be, and in this sense, Ebru is implying that Marx is completely different. But the question is, what is better? Which kind of position is the one that we should treat more favorably? One that actually says, the existing historical development will prepare many of the foundations of the new society, including the revolutionary overthrow of the old, and then we'll have a dictatorship of the old dominated class, dictatorship of proletariat, and then they'll do what they'll do. We can't anticipate. Is this something that makes us comfortable 170 years after the Communist Manifesto, or is this position, does this position make anyone nervous? I mean, in my case, it makes me nervous, this position of we'll have a dictatorship of this new vanguard, not even, of course, obviously it cannot be of all the workers, it will be some kind of elite vanguard, and then it will do what it will do, and we're not utopian, and so we're not going to say what that's going to be. I mean, that's, I think you'll see this very much in Karl Kautsky, the text we'll read next time, the commentary in Erfurt program. He accuses bourgeois thinkers for having said that that socialists never tell us where we're going, and they should. And Kautsky fights against this. He has an idea, as the Social Democrats certainly did, of what we will do initially, but then after that, and is this something that, 150 years after, well, 170 years after the Communist Manifesto, and about 100 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, we can just keep on repeating that, well, the future will know where it's going. All we need to do is overthrow the contemporary arrangement, whatever the cost. I mean, it seems to me that even without going back to Saint-Simon's exact formulas, or for that matter Durkheim's, it is not really plausible anymore to use the word revolution and not have anything in mind, except the freedom of my will if I actually come to power.
If I can add something about your...
Sorry.
No problem. About your question, and I think that that was a little bit my difficulty in trying to make sense of Durkheim understanding of socialism if you compare it with Marx, because there are so many presuppositions that are different that it's very hard to make sense of where you put the line of comparison. But I think that one possible way to do so would be to say, if they both if they both are good readers of Saint-Simon, and in Saint-Simon there is the point in Marx is the point in Marx is how can I make sense of this need that Saint-Simon expresses so powerfully about reorganizing society, rearticulating spiritual and the secular power. In the answer of Marx, we know what it is. I mean, it is that philosophy has to stop interpreting the world and to change it. And so there is this way of conflating
theory and practice that is at the very core of his socialist theory. While if you look at the answer that Durkheim gives, especially in the last 2 chapters of this book, is exactly the opposite. It's exactly the opposite because he says whatever strategies we use in order to try to let conflate these two things, we are going in the wrong direction. So what is possible to do then? And I think the answer of Durkheim, I mean, does this mean that positivism in a Durkheimian sense is just like this value-free, passion-free kind of sciences of social movements? Well, the answer obviously is not, otherwise we would not have engaged so directly with socialism. So certainly positivism is not, we have to get rid of Vienna circle and we have to understand what it meant for these people. And I think in his mind what the point is about trying to say, okay, there is this thing that if we treat socialism as a social fact, we treat socialism noticing that what happened in the 19th century is like a social effervescence that has to be read in religious terms. So we have to make a science that allow to interpret what these religious and political practices are. And in this way, you can skip the risk of may conflate theory and politics. And in this sense, sociology, even if it goes hands in hands with socialism, stay on his kind of theoretical level, and the only function that he can have is to give reflexivity to social movements that are socialist in order to understand and make sense better of their own practices and their own way to orient their own politics. And that's, I think, the way you have to understand this rearticulation. So the point is that it doesn't get rid of the tension between theory and practice, for sure, but he put it in a completely other level. He says, if Saint-Simon's point was the reorganization of the industrial society on one side, and on the other side was to create these new ideals, what we have to take confront in a sociological way is the second, instead of trying to conflate the two together. And so I think that there is, once you do this gesture, then you can start make a comparison between these two socialist thinkers in a way where you can confront, okay, you can have a good Durkheimian criticism, for example, of the concept of class struggle, of state, and so far in Marx, okay? But you have to accept that you are looking at it from a completely other standpoint. Because if you look there, like this way of taking theory and practice together, well, you could not find this in Durkheim. That's my point.
I mean, this continues a lot of debates we have in our department. And I mean, I agree with what you just said in terms of this is Durkheim's understanding of himself and what he's doing. But the question is, can that be successful? I mean, you see, it's another question, because if somebody sees struggle, as Marx does, as creative, that of course means to valorize that this is a struggle of somebody. If somebody sees that as anomic, as a mark of anomy, this of course means that both sides are really wrong, and I'm taking a kind of stance that is an alternative to both of them, to working class and to the employers. And then if you go to the corporate doctrine, I mean, doesn't he actually indicate that the very same problems which the working class movement is concerned with, which they are worried about, should be solved this other way? I mean, after all, the corporate doctrine is not a social fact. There were corporations in European history in the 18th century or 17th, 16th. The corporate Rome even has this kind of structure, so there is a kind of historical fact about it. But the 19th century, the Lex Chapelier and so on, the corporate entities are destroyed. Before modern unionism, the 19th century is atomized in Durkheim's sense in terms of the fundamental social relations. So you are introducing the corporate doctrine as a solution. It has a normative status in Durkheim. So I think that you're right. What he wants to be is a scientist and not a political participant, but in fact he can't, because I don't think anyone can, to tell you the truth. I don't believe that anyone who writes about these matters can remain value-free. But Durkheim's view was different if you read the rules of sociological method. Obviously, he actually is one of the major theorists of positivism. But can he remain consistent doing that? And I think that it's hard. Now, of course, he can treat alternative socialist views objectively, since he doesn't sympathize in any of them. It's his having another position he doesn't yet articulate that allows him to be even-handed. But in fact, eventually he articulates a position, and that position would have been roundly denounced, obviously, within the existing socialist movement. Of course, corporatism then in the 20th century becomes an important phenomenon, not in the form he meant it.